Welcome to the new Lifeboat Hour. I'm your host, Carolyn Baker, and today we are not going to talk about climate change. Absolutely no way are we going to discuss climate change. Now, before you decide that I've sold out and moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the Trumpian Environmental Pollution Agency, let me clarify. We're not going to talk about climate change today because change is not what's happening. What's happening is something on order of magnitude far beyond the pathetic word change. What we need to talk about is climate trauma. And today we have just the person to discuss this with, Zhiwa Woodbury, longtime advocate for Earth and old friend of the new Lifeboat Hour. He was trained in psychology and environmental law, and he manages two blogs, Planetary Hospice and Eco-Psychology Now. Most recently, Zhiwa's academic paper, Climate Trauma Towards a New Taxonomy of Trauma, was published in the Journal of Eco-Psychology. And Zhiwa is also the author of Climate Sense, Changing the Way We Think and Feel About Our Climate in Crisis. Zhiwa, welcome back to the new Lifeboat Hour.
Thanks, Carolyn. It's good to be back. Let me just correct one thing you said. The paper is just in peer review, so it'll be published in a future edition of Eco-Psychology.
Okay, very good. But people can access it now online, can they not?
The paper, a draft of the paper is available on academia, whatever that is, edu. So scholars or people that have access to that.
Okay. Very good. Well, I understand you recently, or at least since the last time we spoke, moved from Boise to Missoula, and I understand that's better for you, correct?
Oh yeah, I'm happy here in Big Sky Country. It's always felt, this is my second go around here in Missoula, and the thing that I love about it is that it's kind of off the cultural grid, you know, as much as you can be and still be in the lower 48.
Right.
And coming back to Montana has been a little bit like jumping out of the fishbowl of American society into a more natural world of Norman McLean's river runs through it. Things just are different here.
Good. I'm glad the move was good for you.
Yeah.
And I'd like to begin with your academic paper on climate trauma. I firmly believe that even if we took climate trauma out of the picture, we're obviously living in a highly traumatized culture, and we have been for decades. The great trauma of my child, of course, was the Cold War and the threat of a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union or China. And, nuclear exchange is still a threat, of course, but as industrial civilization has gone mad with growth, and as we see it collapsing around us on so many levels, we have an additional trauma related to the murder of the planet by industrial civilization and the reality of the sixth great extinction. So, even if we never listen to the news again in our lives or ever read another book, climate trauma influences us. So I'd like you to talk about the new level of climate trauma that takes us far beyond those words, climate change.
Yeah. Well, the world clock, I think, is back close to midnight, the last I heard. So we're once again looking at the possibility of nuclear war that you grew up with, not to mention a continuing onslaught of Fukushima. And so the childhood trauma of your peer group is active again now.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was more a little just slightly after that, but the assassinations of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the latter two coinciding with Kent State and Mayor Daley's police riots at the Chicago Democratic Convention, which is my hometown.
Which, by the way, I was very involved with those and affected by those and traumatized by those. And, they live deep in my nervous system.
Yeah, I think for all of us who went through that, it's become apparent. It only became apparent to me in recent years, how much I'm still affected by the assassination of John F. Kennedy, that was That was just everything changed, you know. And so so that was a time of great social and political upheaval, and it feels quite present right now in the Never Again movement against gun violence, with this next generation deciding they can no longer bear the unresolved trauma that we've passed down to them, involving gun violence, and the continual threat of that their normal childhoods are going to be disrupted. So, you know, as we know, as you and I know, generational trauma, which is passed on genetically, only increases in intensity with each successive generation that it's passed down to, until it's no longer bearable and must be resolved, and a new solution. And that's exactly what we see Emma Gonzalez and those kids advocating for.
Yeah.
And it's been so inspiring how open they are about expressing the trauma. You know, I mean, on social media, she just goes on there and says, this is it, you know, like, this is trauma. And she evokes it so beautifully. And it's incredible to me, you know, how that generation is rising up. But it isn't just these particular unresolved traumas that we're seeing. The Me Too movement is saying enough subjugation of women by powerful men. We're not going to take it anymore, which is challenging the whole patriarchal power paradigm that's defined our civilization from the beginning. The Black Lives Matter movement and tearing down Civil War monuments, all magnified by having a white supremacist in the White House, is once again forcefully raising this unresolved issue of slavery and Jim Crow and reparations.
Right.
Standing Rock triggered a global movement of indigenous peoples that are still traumatized quite severely here in America by genocide.
Yes.
And they're rising as protectors, showing us all a new way of advocacy on the Earth's behalf. And, you know, I could go on with the Israeli Likud party is reviving the Shoah, only this time they're the perpetrators and the Palestinians are being dehumanized. And, you know, this is all necessary from my perspective, and quite welcome, to be honest, this maelstrom of social chaos, in which it finally struck me like a thunderbolt. Of course, the continuing and accelerating assault on our biosphere from poisonous gas being constantly emitted into the oceans and atmosphere is itself trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And permit me just to explain this connection, you know, how all of those social movements and reviving of past traumas led me to this sudden realization, because it'll, I think, for your listeners, will sort of bring home what I mean by the term climate trauma. So one thing that Western psychology, one of the few things, no, I'm kidding, Western psychology has gotten right about trauma after a century of denial, is that when we experience trauma, all our past traumas become present.
Yes.
That's a key insight in this context. So keep it close in mind as I continue. What we've been calling climate change meets the definition of trauma to a T.
Yep.
In fact, one of your neighbors out there, psychotherapist Benjamin White, has observed that climate change seems to embody a trauma response on a grand scale. The greatest trauma on the grandest scale is the way he puts it. And for those in the audience who are not psychologists, this isn't rocket science. It's something we know in our hearts to be true.
Yes.
The Greek word trauma, or wound, originally referred exclusively to bodily insult or injury. But it was the study of sexual trauma that gave rise to modern psychology in the West. And today we understand trauma to mean experiences or situations that are emotionally painful and distressing, and that overwhelm our ability to cope, leaving us feeling powerless. How have we missed this? What we've been euphemistically calling climate change isn't just trauma, Carol. It's an entirely new form of trauma.
Yes, absolutely.
What I would technically call a superordinate form of trauma, which means it subsumes all other forms. As White said, the greatest trauma on the grandest scale. And what distinguishes climate trauma from all the traumas that have come before is not just the scale, which is all inclusive, even altering the natural chemistry of the oceans, but it's constant, not episodic.
Yes.
There's no getting away from climate trauma.
Mm.
There are lots of strategies for avoidance, including just focusing on the symptoms or the science. But because of this unique characteristic of climate trauma, its ever-present nature, it's triggering all of our past traumas and giving rise to this cascade of social movements and forcing us to grow up or fade away. So when Naomi Klein said, "This changes everything," she really hit upon a fundamental truth about climate trauma without having yet recognized the nature of the beast. It really does change everything. But those changes are merely symptoms triggered by the pervasive, ever-present nature of climate trauma. So when this thunderbolt struck me, I realized from a psychological standpoint, this changes everything. We've been going about it all wrong.
Well, you know, I love what you're saying, and there's something you just said in there that just grabbed me. I think you said something like science as addressing the symptoms. Can you say more about that?
Well, yeah, we know the science is settled. Okay, there's no controversy. The only question that science is like, how is science able to keep up, with the full scale of climate change, how fast the climate is changing and everything that entails, and they're scrambling. But how much do you need to focus on the rate of melting glaciers or the rate of permafrost, or how much do you actually have to focus on that to know, oh, this is trauma? And why would you continue to focus on that if the science is settled, unless you were actually trying to keep it at an intellectual level, trying to continue to convince yourself that it's something out there, at the polar caps or in Siberia or something like that, rather than just accepting that this is happening and going inside and looking at how that feels, in your heart and what effect that's having on you, and dealing with your own trauma, right?
Well, it's so much
why
easier.
focus on the trauma out there if it's triggering all the trauma in here? But that's that's kind of the whole secret of dissociation, is that you find some way to keep it away so that you don't actually have to process it.
Yeah. It's sort of like, I just love what you said, dissociation, and we'll talk more about dissociation, but, this addiction to the scientific data versus how do I feel about this, or what is this doing to me and all living beings, you're the first person who's articulated this. I've been thinking it for a long time, but you are really articulating it in such a beautiful way, and I thank you for it.
Well, it's a natural response, especially if you're a scientist and you have this scientific materialist worldview where everything is an object, and you're in here and the world's out there. It's a great strategy for keeping the climate crisis at arm's length.
Absolutely. Well, in your paper, you write about some of the indelible marks of trauma that are being left on us as a culture and as individuals. And would you talk about some of those, please?
Well, there's a number of ways to think about that. So let me begin with the nature of the assault,
Yeah.
uh, in which we are, for the most part, both perpetrators and victims. So we're talking about gassing ourselves and all of life, for that matter. And a big part of the problem here is that there's this 40-year time lag between gases that we emit and the consequences of those emissions.
Right.
So we should think of it as a holocaust that is unfolding in slow motion.
Mm-hmm.
We may not have numbers tattooed on our arms, but we are nonetheless indelibly marked by the horrors of accelerating extinction events, the disappearance of insects and songbirds,
Mm-hmm.
and the knowledge or intuition that we are right now creating a hell on earth that will be experienced by Emma's generation and her children and
Right.
our own progeny. So we have examples similar to this that we can look to with cultural trauma. Though climate trauma is like cultural trauma on steroids. So cultural trauma occurs when members of a collectivity or a community feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. And an example of this in recent times is 9/11, which we all here in America experienced sort of together.
Right.
Or even more recently, the election of Trump. But if we apply these same criteria to the climate crisis, then you get a good idea of what I mean when I say that climate trauma is a superordinate form of trauma.
Mm.
So let's go back to that definition of cultural trauma. It occurs, and put it in terms of climate trauma. It occurs when members of a collectivity or community, in this case, all living beings on the planet, that's pretty inclusive,
Yeah.
feel they've been subjected to a horrendous event. Well, that's the end of life as we know it.
Yeah.
That's pretty horrendous. It leaves indelible marks upon our group consciousness. Here in America, we're now aware that the American dream, as we've always known it, is dead. The idea that we continue to pass on a better world to the next generation, that is the American dream.
Right.
Nobody is fooling themselves anymore in thinking that they're passing on a better world to their children and grandchildren. It's just the opposite. So that's a pretty indelible mark, considering that's our national identity. And so marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. It's interesting that only recently we've acknowledged, scientists have acknowledged that the Holocene era of 11,000 years has ended.
Mm-hmm.
And we are entering into the Anthropocene era, geologic era. What's interesting to me about that is they place the time back 50 years to the first successful nuclear detonation in the White Sands Desert. That's when the markers show up that future, if there is a future, generations looking at geologic layers will say, oh, something different, something's changed here. And so that is a very wonky sort of scientific, but very significant way of saying civilization as we know it has ended. The Holocene is the time when civilization emerged. And to say that has ended, and now we're entering on a new era that is totally going to be shaped by, or is being shaped by, our actions. Calls into question fundamentally our identity. You know, what have we become? So that's that gives you just a taste of what this trauma is triggering.
Well, yeah, and that just leads me right into the next thing I wanted to point out, which is this wonderful phrase that you keep using in the paper, which is calling into question what it means to be human. Because we have no guarantee of any kind of future, and that reality is the elephant in the room in every human interaction. And I love those words, and I wish you would say more about them, please.
So the climate crisis is not a political crisis. I'm sorry to inform our listeners, there will be no political solution. It isn't a technological crisis. There will be no technical fix. It's a spiritual crisis. It's another way of saying that is it's a moral crisis. We are intimately connected to our mother, the earth. Everything is interconnected. Everything's interdependent. And this has been one of the key insights that has emerged during this crisis. 50 years ago, if I said interdependence, nobody would have known what I was talking about.
Right.
Unless they were Buddhists. Many, but now, that's just, it's an interconnected world. Everything depends on everything else, and that's just the given. Many of us felt grief recently at the passing of Sudan, the last male member of the northern black rhinoceros species.
Yes.
He spent the last years of his life under constant armed guard. If you ever saw pictures of that, it's so sad.
Yeah.
We humans like to think of ourselves as humane. And when a species goes extinct, it diminishes us as a species. Part of us dies. And if you're awake and aware, you feel that. If not, you take an antidepressant or an opioid or escape into virtual reality or otherwise numb your heart and mind to the pain.
Right.
It's another way of saying you feeling it, you just don't want to acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm.
So elephants have maybe 10 years left before they disappear from the face of the earth. It's my favorite species, actually.
Yes.
I think they're actually more intelligent than we are.
Mm-hmm.
And objectively, that appears to be true. The water holes that they depend upon to survive droughts are drying up, and those droughts are not breaking. And hippos and giraffes and gorillas are sure to follow.
Yeah.
And closer to my home and my heart, bison and grizzly bears and wolves are quite likely to survive climate trauma. And the oceans, oh my, will be devoid of fish in 3 decades' time.
Right.
That is the track that we're currently on. So what does it mean to be humane? What are humans in a world without lions and tigers and elephants? And so you have the Pope, from my Buddhist way of thinking, a clear reincarnation of Saint Francis, the patron saint of the animal kingdom.
Yeah, it would seem, yes.
Calling on us to engage in dialogue in response to the climate crisis. And what does he want us to talk about? What does it mean to be human? Are we still moral creatures? And so we need to answer that call from the Pope in our own communities. It's not a religious thing. You don't have to go to Catholic Church. It's a spiritual endeavor. He's speaking to everybody. And it's our moral obligation to engage in that conversation, just like we're doing here, Carol. And I thank you for keeping the lifeboat afloat.
Well, thank you. And today, folks, I'm speaking with author and eco-psychologist Zhiwa Woodbury, who's recently published a paper on climate trauma in the Journal of Eco-Psychology, or actually it will be in the Journal of Eco-Psychology soon. And we're discussing that paper today. As most of you know, this podcast is a labor of love for which there's no charge or subscription fee, but I would greatly appreciate your leaving a donation when you listen or share as an expression of gratitude for this work. Thank you for that. And know that I deeply appreciate your support. And I'm so glad that I can come each week or whenever I do a podcast and have these rich, juicy conversations with people like Zhiwa. So I want to go back to our conversation, Zhiwa. You also talk about dissociation, which you mentioned a few minutes ago, in the face of emotional overwhelm and the inability to see our world clearly. This is such an important and relevant topic, and I'd really like you to speak to this reality in our culture.
Well, you really need to have Benjamin White on your program, don't you?
Yeah, I guess I do. Yeah. I'll be asking for his contact information later.
His paper was in the long emergency special edition of the Eco-Psychology Journal a couple of years back, along with a paper that I did on the cosmic bomb. So he says he describes dissociation as the human capacity to mentally escape an insufferable reality. Yeah. And then he goes on to point out basically that this is much more relevant to the climate crisis than the dead horse of climate denial.
Right.
We're all in denial when it comes to climate trauma. Just referring to it as climate change is proof of that.
Absolutely.
Because of dissociation, which we don't tend to talk about, we haven't even gotten to the first step of recovery, which is acknowledging that this is a personal crisis. It's not just another social issue. Think about post-World War II America we grew up in. If your parents, Carol, were anything like mine, they couldn't socialize without hard liquor, and nobody thought anything of helping an inebriated man get behind the wheel of his car to get him home.
Mm-hmm.
Those boys brought the trauma of war home with them.
They sure did.
And society was a form of self-medication.
Mm-hmm.
But finally, with the advent of AA, people began to admit they had a problem. And almost overnight, fermented spirits took the place largely of distilled spirits in social situations, and smoking in public places became taboo, which I never would have believed growing up.
Right.
And the stigma of seeking psychological counseling disappeared. Mm-hmm. So all of that began with admitting we have a problem. I have a problem. I like to start this conversation that the Pope is referring to by saying, my name is Zhiwa, and I'm having a climate crisis.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, speaking of that, as you know, my work for the past decade, similar to the work of Joanna Macy, has been focused on providing people with the emotional and spiritual tools, and you mentioned several in the last answer, the emotional and spiritual tools that are needed to navigate the current and future trauma of the climate catastrophe and the collapse of systems. And I've more recently begun collaborating with my colleague Dean Walker in Ashland, Oregon, to create a body of work called Living Resilience, which people can learn more about at livingresilience.net. And, you know, since psychotherapy has become almost inaccessible for many people, most don't have the luxury of doing long-term therapeutic work on trauma. So Dean and I are aware of this, which is why our work is employing a host of tools to help people deal with the emotional and spiritual repercussions of collapse and climate catastrophe. So as a practitioner of Buddhism and someone trained in psychology, I'm wondering what strategies you see as vital for helping people cope with climate and other kinds of trauma.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing that vital work. I know it's really hard in a culture that's dissociative, you know, we're kind of catalysts for a social movement that's just getting started. And
yes.
At this point, we're still at the stage where no good deed goes unpunished. So I think.
Absolutely.
But this is this is where I get to share with you and your viewers the good news
Yeah.
as I see it. And I think, as I think you know, I've been saying for some time now that the path of recovery for the climate crisis is paved with truth and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
We have the example of South Africa coming out of trauma of apartheid with government-sponsored truth and reconciliation panels.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if we wait for our government to undertake such a process, we're screwed. So, guess what? We're not waiting.
That's right.
As a general matter, while it is still quite messy, I just want to suggest that the rapid rising of these social movements, and it seems like there's a new one every few months, is sparking a culture of truth and reconciliation in the sphere of public discourse. People are talking about power and sex.
Yep.
People are talking about prisons as a new form of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And the insanity of assault weapons everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So truth and reconciliation is a sequential process. And clearly, we are at the stage of facing up to difficult truths right now. If we can do that, reconciliation will naturally follow. More specifically, so that's sort of a lens of looking through at all the political tumult that we see around us.
Right.
And a way of engaging with that and realizing you're doing the work of climate trauma recovery. But more specifically, I want to recommend two current and poignant examples of truth and reconciliation, which I've only come across in the last few days, in the last week. The most recent episode of 60 Minutes, which I hardly ever watch, so it's sort of fortuitous that I even had it on, included a report from Oprah, who I didn't even know was on 60 Minutes, on a new monument to the lynchings of the Jim Crow era, which is the culmination of a truth and reconciliation process begun by lawyers seeking to free Blacks wrongly accused of horrible crimes through DNA analysis. There's a new movie that has just been made freely available online, because watching this movie allows us to participate in the healing of truth and reconciliation for Native Americans. It's called Dakota 38.
All right. Thank
It's a beautiful story about a member of the Dakota tribe who suffers from PTSD from Vietnam, having a prophetic dream that prompted him to lead a pilgrimage to the site of the largest single execution in our history, when Abraham Lincoln ordered the hanging of 38 members of the Dakota tribe. I've posted links to both of these on my Planetary Hospice Facebook page.
Great.
And I'm encouraging anyone who feels traumatized by climate trauma to take the time to watch Oprah's report and Dakota 38 to spark the healing process in themselves and their families and in their communities. It may sound kind of indirect or arbitrary to people, but believe me, if you make the effort, it'll resonate with this approach. It does no good and maybe even harms us to dwell on science and climate change, as we've talked, but recognize instead that our Mother Earth is calling us home and is prompting us to reconnect with our own human nature. And that begins with engaging in these messy social movements and finding a place of healing within ourselves, within our families, and within our communities. I firmly believe that this is necessary work to clear the ground, so to speak, facilitate the emergence of actual solutions to the climate crisis.
I'm totally with you on that. And would you repeat again, that was this last Sunday night, the date of which was April 8th, I believe, and that was 60 Minutes. It was on there this last Sunday night, 60 Minutes, April 8th. And then Dakota 38, is that on Netflix?
It's on YouTube.
On YouTube. Oh, okay. Very good. Very
Yeah. It's so beautiful. Amazing.
Thank you so much for that. And I just have one last question, which is there anything else you'd like to add to our conversation?
Yeah, there is actually.
Okay. Why am I not surprised?
I've begun to notice a pattern in talking about this topic. I'm curious if you're noticing this, that people who engage with it and get it are predominantly women. And the men, who I think should get it, still tend to shut down when I talk about things like climate trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been giving this a lot of thought. Mm-hmm. And I think it confirms what I've long suspected, that we're connected through the psyche, through our psyche, to Earth. And the biggest trauma that preceded climate trauma was our separation from the natural world. Well, that separation was almost exclusively a male phenomenon.
Yeah.
I believe Harry Truman was responsible for cutting the umbilical cord. And the reason that connects us to Mother Earth, and the reason that men shut down is because we have such a hard time admitting that we've failed as providers and protectors, because that's our role. And climate crisis basically is showing we messed up.
Yeah.
Women, by contrast, remain quite directly connected to the Earth because of their procreative and nurturing roles in society. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that I think women have to recognize that they have a special role to play here as spiritual midwives in recovering from climate trauma. Women need to take the lead in starting these necessary and healing conversations and bringing their partners and sons and fathers into dialogue. And fortunately, my experience is that women are a lot more verbal than men anyway. So I think that this role suits them. But I'd really love to see the Me Too movement morph into the Her Too movement, her being our mother, Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And just in case you're wondering, because it certainly was, at first I thought, well, how did I end up being in this position? I'm a man. And speaking personally, I can tell you that I was profoundly changed and feminized by spending 4 months in the Alps of New Zealand meditating on rocks and by rivers and on the mountaintops. So I had to make a special effort to develop a relationship with my own inner anima, with the goddess in nature, which is how I related that experience. And I've had to continue cultivating that ever since. So most of my insights into climate psychology, like climate trauma, have come in meditation practice or in nature, walking in nature. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that we have to send all the men into the woods and let women take control of the government.
Sounds like a plan to me.
Tell me though, has that been similar to your experience?
Yeah, it very much resonates with my experience. And, in my coaching and when I do workshops, I'm just real adamant about helping people. And most people need a lot of help. I think men more than women. Helping people just become familiar with Earth intimacy, because people want to go out and they want to analyze, and well, there's this species and that species, and I'll take my notebook and write this down, and I'll think, and I'll be up here, and I'll be, planning my stock portfolio or whatever while I'm walking in the, and it's like, really, this as an eco-psychologist, helping people get into that intimacy with Earth that we've lost is profoundly life-changing. And the only sane response is, I got to do something. I've got to get involved in these reconciliation processes. So yeah, I totally resonate with what you're saying. And thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that men are more traumatized in a way than the women are. The women might feel it more deeply, but that's only because they're more in touch with that. And it's a problem, I mean, it's not universal, obviously. There are a lot of men in the movement, but it's really important, I think, for the women to recognize that they have a special responsibility as the nurturers and as the procreators, yeah, and yeah, and for men to be humble about it, and to recognize that we have to make a special effort to feel that connection.
It's always been that way in indigenous cultures, I think, for the most part. You talk to somebody like Oren Lyons, and, in those cultures where you have the clan mothers and the women decide if anybody's going to go to war, and if they don't get the women's approval, it's not going to happen. That whole reverence for the feminine that we see in so many indigenous cultures that we just absolutely don't have in our own.
Yeah, it's part of the problem. I mean, this is in a way, this is in a very big picture, the climate trauma is a symptom of that, split in the roles of men and women,
Absolutely.
It also makes sense that women are better at dealing with trauma because of birth. I mean, it's part of, you have a lot of experience with bringing something precious and vital out of a process that's incredibly traumatic and messy.
Yeah.
And that's where we are as a species right now, right? So.
Beautiful metaphor.
Yeah. Also, if we still have time,
We do.
My sort of training began with the study of thermodynamics in college, and math and science fascinated me in theory. I just didn't want to apply it. But thermodynamics was sort of something that I got. And ever since then, I've been fascinated by quantum physics and following it. And this is actually really relevant to the climate crisis, because one of the main obstacles to recovery is the scientific materialist worldview that sees nature as an object or a resource instead of a life source.
Yes.
And objectifies everything, including people. And the quantum, the current or the long-time Newtonian scientific materialist worldview is out of date. It's rather stubborn. It's still the way we've been conditioned to see the world. But what's new and emerging is this sort of quantum worldview, which sees everything as interconnected, and actually, you can reduce, and I've seen quantum physicists do this, you can reduce all of quantum physics down to this one statement, which is that there are no things. When you talk about everything, there are no things, there are only relations.
Yes.
Right? And that's why the climate crisis is a crisis of relations, and why the solutions to the climate crisis will be relational, like changing the way we relate to each other, as we're starting to do with all these social movements, as we're being called to do. But there's an interesting, and I can't remember her name now, but there's an interesting social theorist who has written about quantum activism.
Mm.
So we get really distressed because we're like, the climate is changing really fast and it's accelerating and we're not doing anything. And we're continuing to do the same thing that got us into this mess, and we're never going to be able to get out of it. There's this 30-year time clock. We're all so screwed, right?
Right.
But that's actually, I think, coming from the scientific materialist worldview that sees relations in a linear way, instead of the world we live in, where like population growth is exponential, and change happens like this. We never seem to see it coming. I mean, who predicted Harvey Weinstein would be like destroyed overnight, right? Because of what he's been doing forever, or that the Me Too movement would emerge overnight. Who thought the Soviet Union would fall, like the way it did, almost overnight? We see this again and again with the way change happens. And the way it happens is slowly, and then all at once.
Right.
And so this is actually quite hopeful, because if you see what's happening with all these social movements as that the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation process, and if you engage in your local communities in regenerative agriculture through your farmers markets, or start study groups to talk about climate trauma and how all of this is affecting you and your family and how you feel about it. If we start, and we are doing this, I find this hard to believe, but Paul Hawken, estimates that there are over 4 million little community groups like this. So what climate activism talks about is that we don't need to network with each other. We just need to act in our own communities. And that's where the change happens non-locally. So all of our actions at a local level have consequences that are non-local, meaning not limited in space. So we see this biologically. What's that called? Geomorphology? Or, no, not geomorphology. I don't know. At biological levels, or even like the transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau saw this, that you have this idea and you think it's your idea, and then you find out somebody else had that same, or changing, radical idea somewhere else at the same time.
Yeah.
So we see that these small actions at a local level affect the whole network, like the butterfly effect, right? Can trigger these big changes systemically, but it doesn't happen on our time schedule. It only happens in our hearts and in our relationships. And if we all do our part in our communities to build, to engage in those kind of meaningful relationships, and to process climate trauma, to process all the traumas that are triggered by climate trauma. If we start doing that in our living rooms and in our cafes and at our farmers markets, someday we will get to that point where everything just changes overnight. And it'll be like, wow, all of a sudden, governments get it, and, politicians are doing what they should have been doing all along. And, the change will come from us. It's not going to come from them,
Definitely
And
not.
that's the beauty of quantum activism. And it's a different way of approaching the problem, and it totally avoids the kind of despair and that we're seeing a lot in the movement. because of the political recalcitrance and, oh my God, we've got Donald Trump now and the Environmental Destruction Agency. You know, it looks, if you focus at that level, it looks hopeless.
Mm-hmm.
And Joanna Macy likes to talk about this too. If you focus at the level of where that you live, where things are real, then it's quite hopeful. And I don't think, as someone who's grown up in a privileged, you know, incredibly privileged life, I think it's I don't know if it's Diane Fossey or somebody, Jane Goodall, says we the privileged have a moral obligation to be optimistic. We can't not be optimistic. You know, you call it what you want, but and I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know we're in for a lot of dislocation. We're already seeing it on a global scale with migration, mass migration, and I happen to think, you know, the population is unsustainable, and we're going to have a population crash, and things are going to get really messy, and it's going to be really easy to project all of that into a very dystopian future. But I have faith in the earth as a living organism that's calling us home, and it's the way she's calling us home is through all of this messy social upheaval, and that's exactly how change happens. The more chaotic things are, the higher the potential there is for systemic change to happen. So when right now I'm speaking like today, we're seeing a potential for incredible chaos. Our president is Dr. Chaos. I mean, that's his response to everything, and he's projecting that outward into the world, and it's scary. But we as a people evoked Donald Trump. Whether we want to recognize that or not, mm-hmm. We knew somehow intuitively this is necessary.
Yeah.
And nobody can go to sleep. And everybody's on hyper arousal right now with climate trauma, and Donald Trump is the ringleader of chaos, and he will not succeed. He will end up being an agent of the change that needs to happen, because that's why we're here, because the earth is a living organism, and we're just simple human beings having a climate crisis, you know. So I'm short-term pessimist and long-term optimist.
Yeah, I remember Margaret Wheatley's words in her book Perseverance.
Yes, thank you.
I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist.
That's her. That's the quantum activist woman, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhiwa, and thank everyone for being with us today. It's been my great pleasure to have this conversation with Zhiwa Woodbury, whom I consider an ally, a brother, a spiritual warrior, and friend. Please visit his Facebook page and his blogs, Planetary Hospice and Eco-Psychology Now. Thank you so much, Zhiwa, for joining me today, and thank you for all of you for tuning in to the new Lifeboat Hour. Until next time, stay well, stay safe, and stay awake.
Mm-hmm.